Murder-suicide is not uncommon. It happens probably more often than we think.
Shocking statistics show an uptick in murder suicides across the United States, with more than 1,000 incidents taking place each year.
Oh, it's way more common than you think. Maybe not necessarily the violence aspect, maybe not necessarily the sort of physical abuse, but the emotional abuse, the mental abuse.
Even as recent as last week, a New Jersey murder suicide made national headlines. 57-year-old Peter Ventricelli opened fire on his wife, 58-year-old Kelly Ventricelli, and their 15-year-old son Anthony before turning the gun on himself. Their bodies were found on March 7th when a family friend requested a welfare check. According to a GoFundMe page created by Peter's nephew Carlo Ventricelli, quote, "The shock of this situation has our family at a loss for words."
I'm not surprised that quote unquote no one knew. I'm also not surprised that there were no police records or anything like that. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
But according to forensic psychologist Dr. John Delatorre, there had to have been warning signs.
It's such a difficult thing to see sort of warning signs when it comes to abusive partners, because I think a lot of times the person being abused is willing to engage in some kind of rationalization or justification, but it's a hard thing also to see the sort of very beginnings of coercive control and psychological manipulation and grooming and engagement type behaviors that abusers will use to sort of break down the psychological barriers at first. Once the abuser has broken down the psychological barriers, it's fairly easy to start breaking down the physical barriers as well.
Delatorre says though a motive may not be immediately clear, the murder-suicide likely stemmed from a buildup over time.
And I want to be clear that people don't just snap. There has been a long history of mental, emotional, and physical abuse that had been happening within that relationship that people just did not know. Now, in what way was it manifesting? I don't know. But the truth is that there's always a sign. There's always something there. No one just snaps. Things like this don't come out of nowhere.
Only about an hour northwest of the Roxbury murder-suicide, a separate murder-suicide in Linden, New Jersey, just weeks before. A husband shot and killed his wife and two teenage children. These are just two examples of the more than 300 murder-suicides so far this year, according to gun violence organizations. Statistically, that adds up to 11 murder-suicides each week, totaling about 600 incidents per year.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see it in any relationship in which there is a power imbalance that is maybe not understood by both parties, right? There's always going to be a notion of conflict within a relationship. No relationship is perfect, but what we're describing are individuals who are attempting to maintain power over someone else through specific kinds of means.
But Delatorre believes there is a specific stressor that caused the increase in murder-suicides in America.
A lot of what we see in terms of the increase in murder suicide stem from the 2020 pandemic, particularly the lockdown.
Though we're now several years removed from the COVID-19 lockdown, Delatorre says it may have caused lasting damage in some relationships.
And I think even though the lockdowns have been lifted, I think what we're still seeing are the remnants of that individuals during that time found no coping resource. They found no outlet for anything. Now, usually we think of these added pressures of work and relationships being kind of the primary components to someone engaging in these problematic sort of violent behaviors. But the lockdown presented a unique aspect where individuals who were abusing and were the abused were now trapped essentially in the same house all of the time. So while there might have been an opportunity for relief from the abuse because the person had to go to work or something like that, we didn't really get to see that during the pandemic.
He argues some couples could have formed negative habits during the pandemic and not yet found positive solutions.
There hasn't been an opportunity for individuals to really get themselves out of the holes that they were dug in during the pandemic. And that also has added pressure to these individuals who are likely to engage in maladaptive behaviors, these violent acts. they haven't been able to find a more pro-social outlet for what is going on with inside of them.
The FBI reports 65% of murder-suicides involve intimate partner relationships, with 81% happening at home. According to a study published by Harvard University, 59% of men who killed a female partner then committed suicide. Delatorre believes there's a clear reason why men are more likely to commit murder-suicide.
I think the audience needs to be clear is that it doesn't matter what gender you are. Anyone is capable of violence at any time. What we're seeing, however, is that there are a lot of males who engage in domestic violence and intimate partner violence because of the notion of entitlement, right? Women don't generally have a notion of entitlement the way that men do. Men believe themselves to have access to certain things or get things in the way that they want it. And because they don't get it, or because they don't get it the way that they want it, they're more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors because of the power associated with being just physically bigger.
Delatorre says abusers often use forms of manipulation and later justification for their actions.
The person that's abusing you will then try different manipulation techniques like giving you flowers and apologizing and stuff like that, right? As a way of keeping you sort of in the relationship. It's a very push-pull technique that the abuser is going to look that you probably never even recognize was happening until it's way too late. There are a lot of statistics that go around about the pressures associated with why someone would engage in these kinds of physically violent acts. But again, these are just excuses. These are rationalizations that the individual uses. The person chose to engage in this violent act. They didn't have to. There's nothing in society that says that in order to be dominant, that they have to be physically violent.
But all that doesn't mean women can't also commit the crime.
So again, it's not to say that women can't engage in violence. It's that men are quicker to engage in violence because of societal notions about what it means to be a man and the entitlements associated with it.
The children were killed by ligature strangulation. Ligature strangulation causes the victim to become unconscious anywhere from 10 seconds up to a minute. The more the victim struggles, the longer it takes. After the victim is unconscious, the ligature must be held in place with force, squeezing the neck for up to an additional 4 to 5 minutes to cause death. Therefore, she had to strangle each of them to unconsciousness and then make sure the bands were squeezing their little necks for several minutes. She could have changed her mind at any point during that time and removed those bands from their necks, and she did not.
Massachusetts mother Lindsay Clancy made headlines in January after strangling her 3 young children to death before attempting suicide by jumping out of a second-story window. She survived the attempt and is now charged with multiple counts of murder. But Delatorre says the Clancy incident isn't necessarily the same as a murder-suicide.
When we're talking about why women kill, it's a little bit different than when we're talking about domestic and intimate partner violence. There's some underlying psychological issues that are at play that are very different than someone who's willing to engage in a murder-suicide pact. But if it's only the children, then I think it's something different than if it's a murder-suicide. Now, it could be a little bit the same in that the rationalizations behind committing the act, right? The mother killing her children can be very similar to why a dominant partner would decide to kill the subservient partner and the children, in that they believe that they're going to be in a better place, or they're angry about some, notion that's going on in the relationship, right? They can kind of cross the paths, but the pathology underneath why a woman would kill her children versus domestic and intimate partner violence aren't necessarily the same.
But for those that do commit murder-suicide, having children doesn't necessarily deter the abuser.
Abuse can happen in any form, in any relationship at any time. And just because a child is involved doesn't mean that the abuser is going to stop. Many times, the person being abused is more than willing to take more of the abuse in order to prevent the abuse from then moving towards the children.
9 out of 10 times guns are used to commit murder-suicides, but Delatorre says it's not the only form of murder abusers use.
If you have a gun in the house, the more likely you are to use it. But I don't want people to think that guns are the only way in which abusers are going to kill their partner. Right? There are plenty of ways in which a person can kill another person. One of the again, another underreported aspect of domestic violence is using strangulation. Right. So I think what's unique about the United States is its use of guns. But if a person wants to kill you, there are there are a lot of ways in which they can do so.
As far as prevention goes, Delatorre says there are many avenues to explore.
There are also societal and institutionalized issues that are at play that those need to be reckoned with. There are also just ideas of gender roles and gender norms and how individuals participate within the context of a relationship that also need to be explored and identified. Well, this is not an easy thing to do. There's so many different avenues to explore. So we need to explore all of them first.
If you or someone you know is struggling with domestic violence issues, call 800-799-7233 for the Domestic Violence Hotline. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sarah Gillespie.